In America, socialism is hot again.
Democratic socialism is your kid's public school.
It's our interstate highway system.
It's the researchers and scientists paid with our taxes.
We can do better when we do them together.
Really? I know better, because I'm from Guatemala. I've seen the impact of socialism. My father escaped Cuba. My grandfather suffered under communists in Hungary before escaping. As a child, I was taught socialism was wrong. I grew up mocking it. But democratic socialism sounded okay. It made sense to me that government should take care of the economy.
It's complete anarchy.
But then I watched socialism fail in Latin America.
No hay nada.
I learned that every time a country started down the socialist path, it failed. When Castro came to power, people were excited. They cheered. He was going to help the poor and make everyone equal. But the result?
Sailing for freedom aboard an old green Chevy truck.
Hundreds of thousands fled Cuba. Here, in Little Havana in Miami, Cubans who escaped are eager to remind people how bad life in Cuba had become. This man's father was a doctor.
My father had to sell illegal meat out of his ambulance in Cuba because the government wouldn't pay him enough. I mean, Cuban doctors earn like less than 1% than American doctors.
You don't see any future. Everything is stagnated. Healthcare, education, nowadays they're in ruins.
I tell my Venezuelan friends, we warned you guys.
Esta es la hora del pueblo bolivariano.
Venezuela did not listen. They followed Hugo Chávez down the socialist path.
De las grandes riquezas que hay que distribuirlas por igual, de manera equitativa.
Chávez's promises impressed American celebrities too.
Fascinating guy.
This is you and Hugo Chavez.
Oh, Michael Moore! Michael Moore!
Really?
Come on in. He says, help me write my speech.
El capitalismo es el reino de la injusticia.
Chávez said, I'll take from the rich and give to the poor. When there was no money left, the government just printed more. That caused inflation. 1,000,000% inflation. Now, a chicken costs this much.
Venezuela has, of today, the highest inflation in the world.
When business owners raised prices to keep up with inflation, government often took away their businesses.
Por Dios! Algo de corazón!
That's what's happening to this man.
Ajá, pero eso está en manos del gobierno, ¿verdad?
Chávez seized lots of private property.
¿Y este edificio?
Es un edificio que tiene comercio privado de joyería.
Exprópiese.
Chávez seized thousands and thousands of businesses, just took them away from their owners. Yet most Venezuelans liked that.
People was clapping so hard. They were like, oh, finally, there's somebody here making social justice.
But government grabbing private businesses created shortages of almost everything. Why did you leave your country?
It's like the apocalypse. It's no food, no medicine.
How do you feel when you see other countries with the same mistakes that Cuba has made for the past decades?
Terrible.
Michelle Ibarra escaped Cuba and says Venezuela should have learned from Cuba's failure.
People in other countries in Latin America, they will blame anything else besides socialism.
Blaming socialism for Venezuela's riches to rags story is grossly misleading.
And there are plenty of socialist countries that look nothing like Venezuela.
When I talk about democratic socialism, I'm not looking at Venezuela, I'm not looking at Cuba, I'm looking at countries like Denmark and Sweden.
Why not try my Swedish tradition?
Scandinavia is now called a socialist success. Even people jailed in Venezuela like Francisco Marquez say that.
Yeah, I mean, you have Norway, you have Finland, you have these type of countries that are democratic, that have democratic institutions, and many of them have socialist policies.
In Scandinavia, private business is largely left alone. Governments don't even set a minimum wage. Freedom rankings score Scandinavian countries high on property rights and business freedom.
All Danes enjoy welfare benefits.
Yes, there's a big welfare state, but it's funded by thriving free enterprise.
Denmark.
But so many American politicians say Denmark is a socialist paradise that Denmark's prime minister felt compelled to reply.
Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy.
Denmark is a market economy.
So, if Scandinavia is not socialist, where has socialism ever worked? Nowhere.
What would you say to the Americans that like the idea of socialism and support it here?
I would say that they should wake up. You don't need the government to dictate how to live your life, how much money you should make, how your family should be treated, or how much you should pay. If anything, I think taxes are still a bit high here, but it's the best we have in the entire world.
Think about that. The next time you hear Michael Moore and celebrities praising socialism, socialism wrecks economies, wrecks lives. And in addition, it kills. In my next video, I'll show you why under socialism, violence is inevitable.
Okay. We are not the problem.
Yeah. Do you have a question?
Hate speech does incite violence. Hate speech does incite violence. Black lives matter.
Yeah, gotcha.
These protesters don't want this man to speak. The speaker is Dave Rubin.
Hello, Internet. My name is Dave Rubin. I am the newest host here on The Young Turks.
He was once a leftist.
Obviously, I'm for Obamacare.
You and I both started on the left.
Yeah.
Why did you switch?
Oh, I woke up.
He woke up, he says, after he started doing a podcast and interviewed guests like Larry Elder.
The most blatant racist example you can come up with right now.
Cops are more willing to shoot if the perpetrator is black
What's your data
than white.
What's your basis for saying that? 70% of the homicides are black on black. The idea that a racist white cop and shooting unarmed black people is a peril to black people is BS.
And he just beat me with fact over fact over fact about how systemic racism doesn't exist. Not that racism doesn't exist.
The more people he interviewed, the more he questioned his former beliefs.
I realized that not everyone that these people disagreed with could be a racist and a bigot and a homophobe and a sexist. And that was the argument that was constantly being laid out. If there was a Republican that gave a speech and said, we should lower taxes, their answer was, he's racist. Now that actually makes no sense.
Rubin now considers himself a classical liberal. On his podcast, he tries to interview people from the left and the right.
Should government subsidize gay marriage and straight marriage the same way?
Rubin was surprised that many people on the right were willing to debate.
For all the differences that we might have, I'm pro-choice, most of them are pro-life. You know, I'm against the death penalty, most of them are for the death penalty. They're all willing to sit down and discuss ideas.
When I went from left to libertarian, the right was willing to argue.
If you believe in the individual, then you fundamentally understand that individuals are different. So you are willing to sit down with someone different than you.
Some of his podcasts last 1 or more hours. I never thought that people would listen to interviews that long, but millions of people watch.
I didn't know what was going to happen, but I started doing more of these long-form interviews and people kept watching, and then suddenly I realized, whoa, there's a lot of people that are thinking the things that I'm thinking. Not just me, by the way, there's Joe Rogan and there's others. We're allowing people to go, all right, let's really listen to something. Let's really unpack an idea. You don't learn anything when you watch CNN. You will actually be dumber having watched CNN.
Because you have your own issues and demons to resolve.
All right, guys, we're live on the YouTube.
Because the Rubin Report features some controversial guests.
Milo Yiannopoulos, welcome to the show.
And because he sometimes criticizes leftists, and maybe because his podcasts are so successful, his former colleagues now hate him.
You know, the right wing loves him now because he's a puppet for the right wing. He was lazy when he worked here. He's lazy now with his ridiculous show.
She just sounds envious.
I lost friends. I still lose friends now. I mean, it's incredible because this goes to the laziness of the argument of the left. They believe that if you disagree with them, that you're evil.
Evil is what these protesters call him.
Ladies, I'll gladly take a question from you. Have we established that already?
They say just allowing him to speak is a form of violence. This woman said Rubin's insensitive to the victims on campus.
Biased incidents reports and hate crimes have gone up.
Yeah, so...
And people have been spit on, and people have been threatened, and people have been told to go home to their country.
It doesn't mean that bad people don't exist, but tell me about your oppression. Maybe we can work through something. I mean, tell me about your oppression.
So I have no reason to sit and talk about my own oppression because that's just like mental energy.
Well,
that,
I mean,
like, unless I'm going to be paid.
It's an oppression Olympics. It's a hierarchy of oppressions.
Oppression Olympics?
Yeah, so you've got to figure out how you are oppressed. If you have a limp, you're this much oppressed, or if you're a Jew, this much oppressed, or a Muslim, this much oppressed. Everyone wants to be oppressed.
There's truth behind it. Blacks have been oppressed. Women, some still are. Women are sometimes oppressed.
No society is perfect, but the United States, by and large, has given more freedom to more people from every walk of life, regardless of your skin color, your sexuality. We have problems, yes. We can talk about all of those things, but to tell me those are things because you are oppressed, it ain't true, and that idea needs to be decimated.
While liberal banshees were busy stomping all over D.C. dressed like handmaids and looking like idiots, a woman in New York was just sentenced to 3 years in prison for lying about being sexually assaulted. So no, we shouldn't just simply believe all women who say they've been raped, because yes, some of them are lying. And it happens way more often than you might think. Hey guys, welcome back to Reality Check on MRCTV. I'm Brittany Hughes. On Thursday, a New York woman was sentenced to 3 years in prison for lying about being raped by 2 men during a college party back in 2016. 20-year-old Nikki Yavino actually rolled her eyes in court as one of her victims talked about how her false allegations had essentially ruined his life. Yavino was attending Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut when she filed a report in 2016 claiming she'd been raped by 2 of the school's football players in a bathroom at an off-campus party. But it turns out that she'd actually had consensual sex with the guys and later admitted that she'd lied about it to keep a potential boyfriend. But by then, both football players had been forced to leave school pending an investigation. One of them lost his football scholarship and now says he's $30,000 in debt. Both say they've suffered from anxiety and depression after being falsely accused. This is 27-year-old Jessica Gallagher, another New York woman who lied about being raped by a guy she'd met on a dating app after he refused to drive her home. 21-year-old Mary Zolkowski was given 45 days in jail after she lied about being raped in a Delta College parking lot. 35-year-old Kelly Bartlett was charged in Berry County, Michigan with 10 felonies and 4 misdemeanors for filing a false rape report against an Eaton County sheriff's deputy. 22-year-old Alex Goldman was expelled from Syracuse University and fired from his summer internship at an engineering firm after 22-year-old Catherine Reddington accused him of raping her at a frat party. But a police investigation found no evidence that Reddington had been raped or had even had sex with Goldman that night, and she admitted to being so drunk that she had no memory of what happened. A medical exam and a rape kit found Reddington had no signs of having been raped and found no traces of Goldman's DNA. Even still, Goldman was kicked out of school, lost his job, and is now suing Reddington for $6 million for defamation and personal damages. And this has happened time and time and time again. Duke University, UEA, Columbia. According to the FBI, rape claims are about 4 times more likely to be false than any other criminal complaint. Roughly 8% of all rape claims are never even prosecuted for lack of evidence. For example, there were an estimated 90,185 rapes reported to law enforcement in 2016. This means roughly 7,200 of these were not credible enough to even see the inside of a courtroom. And that doesn't include all of the ones that were dropped, recanted, or proven false. Each one of those cases represents a son, a brother, a husband, a friend. Each one of those cases threatens, and often does, ruin the life of at least one innocent man who finds himself at the end of a mob's pitchfork, unable to clear his name. Rape does happen, and it ruins lives. Women lie about being raped, and it ruins lives. Determining which is which and holding the guilty accountable is the whole point of having a justice system. And if you are honestly okay with condemning a man for such a horrific crime with no proof, simply to gain a political advantage, you're an idiot. Because today, it's Kavanaugh. Tomorrow, it's you. And that's your Reality Check America. Subscribe to our YouTube page, like us on Facebook and Twitter, and stay sane out there. If you're a woman who didn't throw on your pink vagina hat and stomp all over the steps of the Supreme Court this week in protest of Brett Kavanaugh, you're a rape apologist who hates women and are a slave to your white husband. That is what the left thinks of women who don't toe their line. So here's my response. You lost, and I don't feel bad about it. Hey guys, welcome back to Reality Check on MRCTV. I'm Brittany Hughes. Now, we went through this back during the Women's March when all the hags with nothing better to do on a Saturday dressed up like genitalia and left garbage throughout the streets of D.C. But apparently the left didn't get it back then, and they don't get it now. They spent the weekend insulting women who dared to think for themselves and supported Brett Kavanaugh, calling us a whole bunch of misogynistic, self-hating snots with white privilege. We hate our own gender and should stop calling ourselves women, they said. All because we chose to think with our own God-given brains and not act like this. NARAL threw pro-choice Senator Susan Collins under the bus as a rape apologist simply because she upheld our justice system and refused to condemn a man with no evidence. Feminist author Jessica Valenti assumed that she spoke for all of us when she vowed that women will not forget. A New York Times opinion piece took a swipe at all of us women who had the audacity to defy the liberal herd's groupthink, claiming that white women benefit from patriarchy by trading on their whiteness to monopolize resources for mutual gain, and calling for us to come get our people. Guardian writer Lucia Graves explained away women who supported Kavanaugh by saying that they're just doing it so that they can keep their rich husbands and be stay-at-home housewives. She said, quote, "White women are more likely to get and to stay married, and to white men specifically. A conservative voting bloc privileged by the conservative values it votes to uphold. Post-marriage, these women stop associating with the fate of women as a group and associate with their men. Perhaps they see a financial interest in doing so. White women in traditional marriages have historically been reliant on male breadwinners, and white men are still awarded the most money for their time." Hear that, ladies? Now, if you don't do what the liberal overlords tell you to, you're not only a self-hating idiot, but you're also a slave to your husband who campaigns against your own gender because you're a lazy gold digger who wants to live off his money. This is what liberals think of women who step out of line. So as a married, college-educated, professional woman who's been a conservative since I first learned how to read the tax code, let me attempt to explain this to you again. You do not speak for me. You cannot bully me. You cannot insult me into cowering before you and doing things your way. I do not care what you think of me or my family. I care about the fact that our debt is $21 trillion and climbing. I care that Obamacare got rammed down our throats and that working families are still suffering for that to this day. I care that my tax money is being wasted and that Planned Parenthood is still somehow getting $500 million a year. I care that the left spent the better part of a month trying to wreck the life of a good man and his family based on unproven allegations from 35 years ago because their platform is so weak that they can't think of anything else to campaign on. And apparently, they thought that I am so stupid that I would putter along with it because I have lady parts. Newsflash, morons, a full 37% of American women self-identify as Republican. That is about 60 million women, and they're white, black, Hispanic, Asian, low-income, well-off, college students, and grandmas. And that doesn't include all the swing voters in the middle that you seem to be hell-bent on pissing off. That's 60 million conservative women. So if you really think that we're all just a bunch of gold-digging airheads who can be bullied into submission by your lies and your empty smear campaigns and your name-calling, buckle up. Because we're not going anywhere, and we're not yet even close to tired of winning. And that's your Reality Check, America. Make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook and Twitter, and congratulations, Justice Kavanaugh.
The UN makes a catastrophic prediction regarding global warming. I'm Ben Shapiro. This is The Ben Shapiro Show. And the United Nations put out a report, and this is getting all sorts of press on the left, and so I think it's worth going through in detail. So the UN is not a good institution. It is an institution that is replete with the interests of a lot of very, very bad nations who have interests that are not quite American interests. But one area where the UN actually has done some research, one area where science is supposed to take the leading role, is with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There's a big report out today. It came out on Monday, actually, and it is a report all about the supposed higher risk from climate change, even with a lower level of climate change. So we were told for many years that over the course of the next century, we were going to get to 3 to 4 degrees Celsius climate change in across the planet. That was going to be the average climate change. And then it turns out that this new report basically says that we are warming less fast than the UN thought we were. So the UN keeps giving these 10-year windows. And in 10 years, we're really going to have blown it. In 5 years, we're going to have blown it. In 3 years, we're going to have blown it. Well, now, the new report, this should be the headline today. It's not the headline. The new report basically suggests sort of the opposite, that this is in chapter 2 of this new report. And the key quote says, quote, "There is high agreement across various lines of evidence assessed in the report that the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius would be larger than the estimates at the time of the AR5. The AR5 is the last big study they did. That was back in, I believe, 2013, 2014. What that means, in non-science speak, is that it turns out that our carbon emissions have been lower than they thought they were when they first made their estimate, which means that the climate is warming at slightly a lower rate than they thought it would be at this point. So the estimated date for hitting 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming is actually, it's been pushed out further now. They were saying that we were going to hit that in 3-4 years. Now they're saying we're going to hit that in 10 years. They keep pushing that down the line. The reason that this creates some skepticism among folks is not because people don't necessarily believe in climate change at all, as though the climate is not changing. It does raise questions as to the sensitivity of the climate to human-produced carbon emissions, human-produced greenhouse gases. Skepticism, I think, is warranted with regard to some of the more outrageous claims that are being made by UN members and radical leftists who do indeed, many of them, have an alternative agenda. And I'm not just saying they have an alternative agenda, they're basically saying so. There's going to be Eric Holthaus, who is a meteorologist and a visiting scholar at UMNION. I'm not sure, the University of Minnesota, I suppose. He actually calls for an end to capitalism in order to fight climate change. Now, there are a lot of folks on the right who have been suggesting for a long time that was actually the agenda here, that all of the worry, the extreme worry about climate change was really designed to hamper America's economy and the world. And the evidence for this was actually present, right? There was evidence that, for example, the Paris Accords, which were demands on the United States that we were supposed to radically shift how we did business, while other countries made empty promises about how they did business. Right? China suggested, for example, that they were committed to reducing greenhouse gases after peaking in 2030. Well, American studies already showed that China was planning on peaking its greenhouse gases in 2030. So they promised to do something they're already going to do. India promised that they were going to gradually lower greenhouse gas emissions at some point in the future. So that promise didn't mean anything. And so a lot of folks in the United States were saying, well, why are we committing ourselves to attempts and targets when the world's greatest emitters and polluters are not actually tying themselves to anything of substance here? Well, Eric Holthaus, he says this: if you're wondering what you can do about climate change, the world's top scientists just gave rigorous backing to systemically dismantle capitalism as a key requirement to maintaining civilization and a habitable planet. I mean, if you're looking for something to do. So the idea is that we have to get rid of capitalism completely. Where is he getting this from in the report? Well, there's a section in chapter 4 of this UN report that says, increasing evidence suggests that a climate-sensitive realignment of savings and expenditure toward low-emission, climate-resilient infrastructure and services requires an evolution of global and national financial systems. Estimates suggest that in addition to climate-friendly allocation of public investments, that would be like building levees and ensuring that there's infrastructure, a potential redirection of 5 to 10% of annual capital revenues is necessary. So basically, the entire profit margin should be redirected, as the UN suggests that it should be redirected. Now, there are several problems with this report. The first problem is the way that it's actually reported by the mainstream media. So the way that the New York Times reports this is that it's a landmark report from the UN Scientific Panel on Climate Change, painting a far more dire picture of the immediate consequences of climate change than previously thought. Except that's not really true. Not much change between the 2013 report and this particular report, the AR5 in this report. Not much changed at all. In fact, the only thing that really changed is that they said that their forecast for doom has actually been pushed out a few more years. But the way the New York Times covers this is that everyone is going to die at 1.5 degrees Celsius change by 2040, as opposed to 2 degrees Celsius change by 2040. The report issued on Monday by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that it describes a world of worsening food shortages and wildfires, a mass die-off of coral reefs as soon as 2040, a period well within the lifetime of much of the global population. When the New York Times says that, what they want you to picture is The Day After Tomorrow, that movie with Dennis Quaid, where suddenly a giant tsunami just washes through New York City and sets the whole place under ice for 1,000 years. And global warming is responsible for the rise in the sea levels, and everyone dies, and it's catastrophic. It's deep impact, except with climate. The problem is that that's not really true. All of this climate change is going to happen over the course of the next century. Human beings are pretty good and adaptable when it comes to adapting over time to threats that present themselves over time. Climate has been changing across the world for the last century and a half, really since 1880, 1870, and human beings have been migrating and moving and developing new technologies to deal with all of that, and the same will hold true in the future as well. So according to Bill Hare, who's author of previous IPCC reports and a physicist with Climate Analytics, a nonprofit organization, they're a left-leaning one, we were not aware of this just a few years ago. It's quite a shock and quite concerning. So this is the first report commissioned by world leaders under the Paris Agreement, which again is that 2015 pact that people supposedly signed but really made no real commitment to keep. And Trump said this is a waste of time and pulled us out of it. So the authors found that if greenhouse gas emissions continue at the current rate, the atmosphere will warm up by as much as 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, 1.5 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels by 2040, inundating coastlines and intensifying droughts and poverty. There are significant problems, I should mention, in climate change modeling. None of the models that have been put forth so far actually reflect the level of climate change that's been occurring. Virtually all of them overshoot the mark. And that's because climate is actually very difficult to predict. There are a lot of factors that are involved in climate. Now, how much of climate change is caused by human activity? Certainly some. The IPCC says 80%. Folks like Roy Spencer, who I'm sure you've heard on other talk radio shows, you've heard him on Rush Limbaugh. Roy Spencer, he says that he thinks it's about 50%. But certainly our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions leads to climate change. The question is really not whether that's happening, it's to what extent, and also what the economic damage is from such climate change, what the human damage is from such climate change. So the New York Times is playing this up as much as humanly possible. Avoiding the most serious damages requires transforming the world economy within just a few years, say the authors, who estimate that the damage would come at a cost of $54 trillion. But while they conclude that it is technically possible to achieve the rapid changes required to avoid 2.7 degrees of warming, they conclude it may be politically unlikely. For example, the report says that heavy taxes or prices on carbon dioxide emissions, perhaps as high as $27,000 per ton by 2100, would be required. That's a $40 per gallon tax on carbon. That's what you're talking about. Every time you go to the pump and you buy 10 gallons of gas, you'd now be paying $400 in tax in order to meet that $27,000 per ton number. The Obama administration had suggested $50 per ton, and that was considered high at the time. Okay, all of this is to say that these estimates are wildly overstated in terms of the amount of damage that they are likely to do. The reason that I say that is because the report itself, the way that these things get reported in the media is that there is virtual certainty in the scientific community that this stuff is going to happen. The problem is that virtual scientific consensus doesn't actually exist on a lot of key issues. So, for example, as I pointed out this morning, there are significant questions in the report about the level of confidence in specific predictions. So in just a second, I'm going to talk about those specific predictions. Okay, so here's what you need to know about the IPCC. So the IPCC makes two types of predictions in this report. The first type of prediction is that 2 degrees of global warming will be worse than 1.5 degrees of global warming Celsius. Okay. And they say that with high confidence, meaning by their metric, 8 in 10 confidence, 80% confidence. Okay, well, that sounds fair, right? I mean, it seems like more global warming would be worse than less global warming. That seems like the assumption that we're going on. Then they get to the actual specific predictions. And with those, virtually every specific prediction they make about the amount of damage that's going to be done to the world climate based on 1.5 degrees Celsius of change, virtually all of their predictions are couched in terms of medium confidence. Medium confidence, according to the IPCC, at least according to a 2007 report where they defined the terms, it's the only place I could see them defining the terms. Medium confidence means a 50-50 shot. So basically flip a coin as to whether they are right or wrong on this. And then you are going to determine whether we ought to destroy capitalism on the basis of this. So, for example, in the first chapter, well, in the summary of findings for the IPCC report, it says of the 105,000 species studied, 6% of insects, 8% of plants, 4% of vertebrates are projected to lose over half their climatically determined geographic range for global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared with 18% of insects, 16% of plants, and 8% of vertebrates for global warming of 2 degrees Celsius. So basically, everything is going to double. Right? Everything is going to double, and for insects, it's going to triple. Everything bad is going to double, and then for insects, triple with 2 degrees Celsius of change versus 1.5 degrees Celsius of change. But that is expressed at medium confidence. Okay, so there's a 50-50 shot they're right. Are you willing to bet the future of the world economy and leave billions of people in poverty in developing nations on a 50-50 bet that they are right about the spread of insect-restricted areas? I mean, really, is that a bet that you're willing to make? Because now you're taking a virtual certainty that hundreds of millions of people will live in poverty and increased conditions of poverty, and you're betting that against the 50-50 possibility that some bugs will have less space to live, or that 16% of plants will lose half their climatically determined geographic range. Now, that's a serious consideration, but I think that there's also the possibility that, number one, the scientists are wrong, and number two, there's the possibility that technology tends to actually manifest itself in different ways, that when you see serious economic, serious environmental problems, technology is a good way of mitigating against that. In fact, there's a good case to be made that global warming, because it's a greenhouse effect, has acted kind of like a greenhouse. What you've seen is an increased greening in certain parts of the globe, specifically because of global warming. And that's sort of a repeated thing in this IPCC report. The more specific they get, the lower their confidence level. So, for example, they say about approximately 4% of the global terrestrial land area is projected to undergo a transformation of ecosystems from one type to another at 1 degree Celsius of global warming, compared with 13% at 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. So if it's 2 degrees Celsius global warming, 13% of the entire global terrestrial land area is going to be transformed in terms of ecosystem. But again, they say that with medium confidence. So what they say with full confidence is that 2 degrees is worse than 1.5 degrees. What they say with medium confidence, meaning half-half, is that this change will be really, really dramatic. Right? That's basically the case that they are making. Now, when I say all of this, folks on the left immediately say, well, you're a climate change denier. Again, I'm not denying climate change is taking place. I'm asking what the actual impact of climate change will be, and two, what measures will be necessary in order to curb said climate change. So I want to take another story that's in the news today because it's sort of astonishing. Yesterday, a guy won the Nobel Prize in economics. His name is William Nordhaus. He works over at Yale. And the left championed this guy, William Nordhaus. Why? Because William Nordhaus has, for years, been modeling what sort of economic systems would be best in terms of curbing global warming. And this has been his actual life work. So the left said, oh, look at that. That's a slap against Trump. It's a slap against the right. Finally, we're rewarding someone in economics who takes global warming seriously. But there's a serious problem with this particular take on William Nordhaus and Romer, the guy who he won a Nobel Prize in economics with. It turns out that their arguments actually undercut some of the arguments being made by the same folks who are promoting them and promoting this IPCC report. Okay, so as I say, a lot of folks on the left very excited about William Nordhaus actually winning a Nobel Prize in economics for his work on the economics of climate change. There's only one problem with this. Nordhaus actually argues that we should only intervene economically. We should only shift our economy when the costs of not intervening outweigh the costs of intervening, which makes a lot of sense, right? So if you're not going to intervene and the costs of climate change are really high, then you should intervene, right? This is how you make all your decisions in life. You make every decision in life. The cost of me acting, is it better or worse than the cost of me not acting? So what Nordhaus basically says is we have to determine whether the cost of action is more expensive than the cost of inaction. What point does that become a reality? At what point do we actually have to act? Well, according to Mr. Nordhaus, the actual number is the optimal temperature increase where we have to act is when there's a climate change of 4.1 degrees, which is about 2.3 degrees Celsius. Okay, so higher than anything the IPCC is talking about. In fact, his model is called DICE, and there is a 2013 model version that he posted in an Excel table. The key data here is that he estimated a cost in the year 2100 of 4% of global GDP. which is the equivalent of reducing annual growth over the century from about 2.27% to 2.22%, or postponing the prosperity of 2100 until 2103. So if the worst case scenarios hit, he is talking about a cost in the year 2100 of 4% of GDP, which is not all that high. We can cope with it. It's something that we can deal with. In August, he actually published an updated discussion of this model. I talked to the Orrin Cass this morning, who's an expert on this stuff over at Manhattan Institute, does wonderful work. Like me, I think he's what you would call lukewarmer, meaning that he believes that global warming is happening, but he's skeptical of a lot of the answers that are being given for how to curb it. According to Orrin, Nordhaus published a discussion of his latest model in the American Economic Journal, in which he argued that holding warming below 2.5 degrees Celsius is implausible and not cost-effective. In other words, we've already hit 1.5 degrees Celsius. We've probably already hit 2 degrees Celsius. There's nothing we can do there. He says the optimal trajectory would be mitigation that reduces warming from 4.2 degrees Celsius to 3.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. Here's what he says. He says the international target for climate change with a limit of 2 degrees Celsius appears to be infeasible with reasonably accessible technologies, even with very ambitious abatement strategies. So in other words, the person that the left is now celebrating for winning the Nobel Prize in economics because it's a slap at Trump doesn't agree with them and doesn't agree with the IPCC on the sort of action that is necessary in order to avoid catastrophe. So it's a pretty important thing to know, you would think, but the media is not covering any of that stuff. Instead, they're just going with the fully alarmist idea that we are on the brink of disaster and we're all going to die. The IPCC report, by the way, makes a bunch of political statements. Many of them are uncalled for, including they go after nuclear energy. So if you actually did want to curb carbon emissions, if you actually did want to prevent global warming by curbing greenhouse gases, presumably you'd be in favor of nuclear power. But the IPCC authors, because they are politically of the left, oppose nuclear energy. Here's what they say. They say nuclear energy can increase the risks of proliferation, have negative environmental effects, e.g. for water use, and have mixed effects for human health when replacing fossil fuels. Okay, that's just not true. Studies show that the nuclear energy industry is the safest industry in making electricity. Climate scientists found that nuclear energy has saved 1.8 million lives by preventing premature deaths from air pollution. This is according to Forbes.com. Where nuclear was 19% of U.S. electricity last year, solar and wind still constitute just 1.3 and 6.3% of electricity. But the IPCC is saying, forget nuclear, forget coal, forget gas. Instead, we need to bank on solar and wind. Yeah, good luck with all of that. Good luck with all of that. All of this seems, frankly, like an attempt to avoid the reality, which is that we have to make economic decisions based on possibilities and probabilities, that you don't get to destroy capitalism wholesale just because you don't like capitalism. And when you hear people saying wild things about how the cities are going to be underwater and millions of people are going to die and all the rest, just remember that there is an agenda backing some of these folks, and that the alarmist predictions of folks like Al Gore have not, in fact, come true. That doesn't mean we shouldn't take global warming seriously. We should. But that's why we should use money for abatement. That's why we should be looking at building levees. It's why we should be looking at creating barriers to tsunamis and figuring out exactly how to move people inland. It means that there are lots of ways over the course of the coming century for us to deal with some of the increased problems of climate. But exaggerating the problems of climate ain't going to do it. And then suggesting that we overthrow capitalism to do it is not exactly a smart solution. Nonetheless, radicalism rules the day. And it's driven by a sort of weird millenarianism. This idea that we are immanentizing the eschaton, that we are about to experience the end of time. Now, this existed in a lot of religious communities. The early Christian community thought that sort of the kingdom of God was at hand. It's happened in the Jewish community too. You see it among certain Muslim sects. Well, you see it in the secular world too. The idea that we are living in the end times and the apocalypse is basically upon us. And that means that harsh action is necessary. We need harsh action now. We need crazed action now, because if we don't, everyone is going to die. Millions will die. Millions will die. And we keep hearing this about the increase of hurricanes and tornadoes, even though there's been no actual increase in the number of hurricanes or tornadoes. We keep hearing this about the supposed outsized impact of hurricanes and tornadoes, even though, for example, in Bangladesh, which just experienced a pretty significant hurricane within the last year, about 4,000 people died in the 1990s. There was a similar-sized hurricane, 100,000 people died. What did that mean? It meant that Bangladesh actually spent the money and provided the resources necessary so that fewer people died. In other words, human beings, as intelligent animals, have the capacity to adapt to our environment. We've been doing it our entire existence. Nonetheless, the feeling that we are living in crisis mode has permeated the left to a really extraordinary extent. And that reaches all the way down to the lowest level of the Democratic Party. I mean, the lowest level, meaning the folks in Antifa. So if you haven't seen this, I have to show you this tape from Antifa in Portland. Antifa has basically taken over the city. For folks who don't know what Antifa is a wild leftist group. They call themselves anti-fascist. What they actually want to do is prevent anyone from saying anything they disagree with. They just want to prevent anyone from talking. They wear black. They beat people up who they disagree with. They took over an actual intersection in Portland, and the authorities did nothing about it because, of course, this is Portland.
Just go that way. Because I told you to.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Don't hurt
Yeah,
me.
brother.
Just go.
Yeah, you little white little.
Really?
Yeah, you're a little whitey, aren't you? The First Amendment. Get the down the road.
Please just keep going the direction.
Just please turn right
Please
for Christ's
go
sake.
the direction I asked
For
you to
Jesus
go.
Christ's sake, let's turn
Please,
right.
you're
Well, yeah.
blocking traffic and they're getting pissed at you.
blocking traffic.
You can turn.
Okay, so obviously Antifa has taken over the city, and they're telling people where to go. Where the hell are the cops? Well, the answer is the cops are nowhere to be found because for months, Portland has been controlled by Antifa. There's an article from August 2018 by Andy, I believe it's pronounced Nago, or maybe the N is silent. He's an editor at Quillette, and he has a piece called "Anarchy Breaks Out in Portland with the Mayor's Blessing." Here's what he says. Along the trolley tracks behind the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Field Office, a biohazard cleanup crew works under police protection. It finds used needles and buckets of human waste simmering in nearly 100-degree heat. The smell of urine and feces fills the block. For more than 5 weeks, as many as 200 people had occupied the site to demand ICE's immediate abolition. They're gone now, but the community is left reeling. 38 days of government-sanctioned anarchy will do that. A mob surrounded ICE's office in southwest Portland June 19th. They barricaded the exit. They blocked the driveway. They sent guards to patrol the doors. They trapped workers inside at night. They laid on the street, stopped traffic at a critical junction near a hospital, and police stayed away. At this time, I'm denying your request for additional resources, said Portland Police Bureau Deputy Chief Robert Day, writing to federal officers pleading for help. Hours later, the remaining ICE workers were finally evacuated by a small federal police team. The facility shut down for more than a week. So the locals just let Antifa run roughshod. And that's not really a surprise. The radicals have taken over large swaths of left. Tom Perez, the head of the DNC, is now essentially admitting that there are no moderates left in his own party.
When we see that there are no guardrails in Washington, I mean, we know that for sure. There are no moderate Democrats basically left, moderate Republicans left in the United States. There are no moderate Republicans left in the United States Senate.
Freudian slip there from Tom Perez. There are no moderate Democrats because there really are none. I mean, the number of moderate Democrats has declined. Please leave us a review at iTunes. It really does help the rankings over at iTunes. So we encourage you to leave a 5-star review. If you don't like the show, don't leave a review. Instead, I think you have better things to do with your time, frankly. So go check us out right now. We are the largest, fastest growing conservative podcast in the nation.